The storm had been pounding the mountains all night when 70-year-old Harold Whitman opened his cabin door to throw out a bucket of melting snow. He expected nothing but wind and darkness. Instead, he froze, because lying on his porch, curled against the cold wood, was an old German shepherd whose fur was soaked, whose breathing was shallow, and whose eyes held a story too heavy for words. Harold's heart stopped. He hadn't seen a dog up close since his wife passed, since the world got quieter and the mountains felt bigger than they used to. But this dog, he wasn't just lost. He wasn't just tired. He had come here with purpose. Because around the shepherd's neck, tied by a piece of worn leather, was a single folded note, a note that would turn Harold's quiet life upside down, a note that would force him to face memories he had buried for decades, a note that would reveal why this dog, this old, trembling, exhausted dog, chose his porch out of every cabin in the valley. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring you more emotional, heartwarming stories about loyalty, second chances, and the bonds that never die, not even with age. Now, let me tell you what Harold found written on that collar, and how it changed not just his night, but the entire course of his life. Harold Whitman stood in the open doorway of his cabin, breath turning white in the icy air, staring at the old German shepherd lying motionless on his porch. For a moment, the world felt suspended, as if the wind itself had paused to witness the scene. Snow collected on the dog's fur, melting in slow droplets that ran along its muzzle. The animal's chest rose and weak, uneven tremors that shook Harold deeper than he expected. He hadn't seen a dog since Mary died, and he certainly hadn't expected one to arrive on his doorstep in the middle of a mountain storm. "Hey there," Harold murmured, voice rough with age and surprise. "Where'd you come from?" The dog opened one eye. It was clouded, tired, but still carried that unmistakable shepherd intelligence, the kind that read people faster than people read themselves. Harold felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he had buried many winters ago. He knelt, slowly, painfully, and pressed 2 fingers gently to the dog's collar. The leather was stiff from snow, but intact. Attached to it was a note he had seen, a small, folded piece of paper, soaked at the edges but still readable. He hesitated. Something about the note felt private, as if opening it would tie him to whatever story this dog carried. But the dog let out a faint whine, one that sounded like both pain and plea. "All right," Harold whispered. "Let's see what this is about." His cold fingers struggled with the wet paper until he finally unfolded it. He held it near the porch light, eyes narrowing to read the shaky handwriting. "Please take care of him. He won't survive another winter alone. His name is Ranger, and he knows you." Harold blinked. His stomach dropped. He read the words again and again, as if repetition might make them make sense. "Knows me?" he whispered. He looked at the old shepherd, Ranger, lying at his feet. "How could you know me?" But Ranger only closed his eyes, too exhausted to answer even with a glance. Questions collided in Harold's mind like crashing waves. Who wrote the note? How did they know him? How did this dog know him? His heart thudded hard against his ribs, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a younger man, back when life still surprised him more than it disappointed him. The wind whipped across the porch again, reminding him sharply of the cold. Ranger let out a soft, shivering breath. Harold snapped into action. "Come on, boy. You're freezing." He slipped his arms under the shepherd's frail body. Ranger was lighter than Harold expected, far too light for a dog his size. He lifted him carefully, grunting through the strain, and carried him inside the cabin. Once the door shut behind them, a wave of warm air washed over them both. Harold laid Ranger beside the fireplace on an old woven rug. The flames flickered warmly across the dog's worn fur, revealing scars Harold hadn't seen outside of military dogs or those raised in harsh working environments. He fetched a blanket from the armchair and draped it over Ranger gently. "Let's warm you up," he said. The dog remained still, breathing shallowly, but his ear twitched at the sound of Harold's voice. That tiny gesture twisted something in Harold's chest like a knife made of memories. He sat beside Ranger and looked again at the note. Whoever wrote it, they had trusted him with this fragile, elderly dog, trusted him enough to send Ranger to his doorstep on the coldest night of the year. Harold stared at the last line. "And he knows you." His jaw tightened. "I don't know you," Harold said softly to the dog. "Do I?" Ranger shifted, opening one eye again, focusing on Harold's face. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Harold saw something there. Something eerily familiar. The dog gazed at him with a quiet recognition that made Harold's skin prickle. A memory tugged at him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. But he pushed it away, too sharp, too painful. He stood abruptly and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen. He filled it with warm water, returned to the fireplace, and placed it beside Ranger. "Try," he encouraged. Ranger's tongue slid weakly across the surface of the water. Harold let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good boy." That's when it happened. Ranger lifted his paw, old, shaky, and placed it on Harold's knee. Harold froze. The warmth of that paw shot through him like lightning. He swallowed hard, blinking away the sudden sting behind his eyes. Too many years had passed since something had reached him this deeply. He placed his hand gently over Ranger's paw. "You've had a hard life, haven't you?" Ranger's eyes softened as if answering silently. Outside, the wind howled, pushing snow against the windows like icy fingertips. The storm was far from over. But inside the cabin, a fragile, unexpected sense of companionship began to settle in the room. Harold hadn't realized how quiet his life had become until he heard Ranger's faint breaths filling the silence. His home had been too still for too long, a stillness born of empty chairs and the absence of laughter. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt shared. He read the note again, the words burning into his mind. "Please take care of him." "I will," Harold said out loud, surprising himself. The dog's ear flicked again. Harold sighed and leaned back against the rocking chair, eyes never leaving Ranger. "Whoever sent you, they knew I'd take you in." Ranger let out a quiet exhale, almost a sigh. Harold smiled sadly. "Guess they know me better than I know myself." The fire crackled softly. The storm raged outside. But in that little cabin on the mountain, a retired man and an old shepherd shared their first night together. Two souls worn by time, brought together by a mystery neither of them fully understood. And as Harold drifted into a light, uneasy sleep beside the dog he was suddenly responsible for, he didn't yet realize one thing. This was not the dog's first time meeting him. Morning came slowly, as if the sun hesitated to rise over a night full of unanswered questions. The storm had quieted, leaving a thick blanket of white across the mountains. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low but steady, casting warm light over the figure of the old German shepherd resting on the rug. Harold rubbed his eyes as he shifted in the rocking chair. His back complained instantly. Too many years, too many winters. But his attention went straight to Ranger. The shepherd was awake. Barely, but awake. His cloudy eyes followed Harold with slow, deliberate movement. His tail made the faintest thump against the rug. "Well, look at you," Harold murmured, fighting back an unexpected warmth in his chest. Still hanging on. He kneeled beside Ranger with a bowl of fresh water and a small piece of boiled chicken. The dog sniffed the food timidly, then took it gently from Harold's fingers. "There you go," Harold whispered. "Good boy." Ranger's ears flicked, recognizing the tone more than words. And once again Harold felt the strange, unsettling sensation of being recognized. Truly recognized, by a creature he supposedly had never met. He sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. "Who sent you, to me?" The note lay folded on the coffee table. Harold had read it so many times that he could recite it silently. "He knows you." The handwriting was shaky, almost fading in places. Whoever wrote, it wanted the message delivered before it was too late. Harold looked at Ranger again. "How do you know me, boy?" Ranger lifted his head at the question, holding Harold's gaze longer this time. The dog's eyes, oh, but deep, reflected something Harold hadn't expected. Not confusion, not fear. Recognition. Memory. Something ancient and heavy. Harold's heart stuttered. Something inside him shifted, like a locked door rattling from the inside. "You look at me as if—" He stopped himself. "No, that's ridiculous." He stood, pacing slowly across the wooden floor. His cabin was filled with relics of a life lived fully long ago. Photographs, his wife's paintings, souvenirs from his years traveling when his legs were still strong. But among the framed memories lining the shelves, one in particular caught his eye. A photograph, old, yellowed, leaning against a dusty lantern. Harold picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of himself, roughly 20 years younger, standing beside a much younger German shepherd. Strong, bright-eyed, full of life. He could almost hear the dog's bark echoing through time. Harold swallowed hard. "Buddy," he whispered. "My old partner." Buddy had been everything. Loyal, protective, always by his side during the hardest chapters of Harold's life. When Buddy disappeared unexpectedly one winter, Harold searched the mountain for days. But Buddy never returned, and Harold had mourned him like a child. He looked at Ranger again. Same breed, same face shape, same quiet intelligence. But not the same dog. This one was older, weaker, carrying years Harold couldn't account for. Still something in the eyes. Harold kneeled beside Ranger once more. "You're not Buddy," he whispered. "But why do you look at me like he did?" The shepherd pressed his muzzle weakly against Harold's hand. Harold froze. It was the same gesture Buddy always used when Harold came home late, from long work days, or from losing himself in grief after Mary passed. A gentle nudge, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Emotion swept over Harold like a breaking wave. "You knew Buddy, didn't you?" he whispered. "Somehow you were connected to him." Ranger closed his eyes, leaning his head into Harold's palm. The realization hit Harold slowly, painfully. This dog wasn't random. He wasn't lost. He had been sent by someone who knew Harold's past, someone who knew Buddy, someone who knew how much Harold needed a companion again, even if it came wrapped in mystery and old age. Harold sat there for several long minutes, stroking Ranger's head gently. The dog's breathing steadied, a little stronger than the night before. "You're safe now," Harold whispered. "I don't care where you came from or who sent you. You're safe with me." Ranger's tail thumped once, weak but grateful. Harold didn't notice the tears slipping down his face. But Ranger did, and for the first time in years, Harold didn't wipe them away. The next morning brought a pale, muted light through the frosted window panes. Harold stood by the stove heating water, listening to the faint breathing of the German shepherd lying near the fire. Ranger was still weak, but stronger than the night he arrived. He lifted his head now and then, sniffing the air, following Harold's movements with quiet awareness. "You're doing better," Harold said softly, pouring warm water into a tin bowl. "Stronger today. Good. We'll build you back up." Ranger blinked slowly, as if agreeing. Harold sat beside him, offering small pieces of chicken he had cooked earlier. Ranger ate gently, careful not to bite Harold's fingers. The dog's respectfulness reminded Harold again of Buddy, that same quiet discipline, that same attentive spirit. But Harold pushed the thought away. Too many coincidences only made the mystery heavier. After Ranger finished eating, Harold stood and grabbed his coat. "I'm just stepping outside for a bit. Gotta check the generator." As he opened the cabin door, cold air rushed in, sweeping across the room. Ranger's ears perked up, following him with subtle alertness. Harold stepped onto the porch, squinting at the endless white stretching across the mountains. The storm had left the landscape blanketed in deep snow, untouched except for one thing: footprints, a trail of them, leading to his porch, but not away from it. Harold's stomach tightened. He moved closer and examined the prints. They were human and fresh. The snow hadn't fallen since late last night. These tracks couldn't have been older than a few hours. "Someone brought you here," he whispered, looking back at the door. He followed the trail slowly, boots sinking deep into the snow. The prints led down the path toward the tree line, then disappeared several yards later where the snow grew deeper. The person had stopped, turned around, stood there for a moment, then nothing. No continuation, no retreat. The track simply stopped. Harold frowned deeply. What the hell? He scanned the forest. Nothing moved except drifting flurries and swaying branches. Whoever had brought Ranger had vanished into the woods like a ghost. A cold unease crept up Harold's spine. Was someone watching him? Was Ranger in danger? Or worse, was Harold? He slowly headed back toward the cabin, his breath fogging the air with each step. When he reached the porch again, Ranger was somehow standing, shaky, but on all fours, watching him from behind the doorframe. "You shouldn't be up," Harold said softly as he entered. But Ranger wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Harold, on the snow, on the footprints. Ranger sniffed the air, then took a few steps forward until he reached Harold's leg, touching it lightly with his nose. Harold's breath hitched. "You know who made those prints, don't you?" Ranger blinked once, slow, deliberate. Harold felt something inside him twist. He kneeled in front of the shepherd. "Whoever brought you here, why didn't they stay? Why leave you on my porch?" Ranger looked at the door, then back at Harold. His tail didn't move. His ears lowered. It wasn't fear the dog expressed. It was sorrow. Harold cupped Ranger's face gently. Did something happen out there? Ranger's body trembled subtly. Harold swallowed, dread settling heavily in his chest. He looked again at the note on the coffee table. "Please take care of him. He won't survive another winter alone. He knows you." Harold closed his eyes. The truth he had avoided since last night whispered through his mind, cold and unwanted. Someone had left Ranger there because they couldn't care for him anymore, or because they weren't alive to do it. When Harold opened his eyes, Ranger had lowered himself back onto the rug, exhausted. The dog rested his head on his paws, eyes clouded with something far deeper than age. "You're grieving," Harold whispered. "Just like me." He sat beside Ranger again, this time letting his hand rest on the dog's side without hesitation. "We'll find answers together," he said. "Whoever brought you here will figure it out." Ranger looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving, the shepherd's tail gave a soft thump of hope. But outside the cabin window, the wind picked up again, carrying a sound that made Harold's blood run cold. A distant howl, long, low, not from a wolf, not from any wild animal he recognized. It was a human scream, echoing through the forest. The scream echoed through the trees like something torn from another world. Harold froze where he stood, breath held tight in his chest. The sound wasn't just loud, it was desperate, human, hurting, and coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Ranger's reaction was immediate. The old shepherd jerked his head up, ears fully alert for the first time since arriving. His body trembled, but not from weakness this time, from instinct. His tail stiffened, his paws braced against the rug, and a low rumble rose in his throat. "You heard it too," Harold whispered. Another scream cut through the cold, shorter this time, but unmistakably real. Harold grabbed his coat, heart pounding. He looked down at Ranger. "I have to check it out." Ranger struggled to stand, wobbling, legs shaking beneath him. He wasn't ready to walk, much less run, but he tried anyway. Harold kneeled and pressed a firm hand to the dog's chest. "No, you're staying here. That's not up for debate." Ranger whined, a deep, aching sound that told Harold the dog understood exactly what danger lay beyond the cabin. "I won't be long," Harold promised, even though he wasn't sure. "Stay by the fire. Rest. I'll come back." Ranger's ears lowered, reluctantly accepting the order. Harold stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. The cold bit through his coat instantly. Snow cracked under his boots as he made his way into the woods, following the direction of the sound. Branches creaked above him. Wind sliced across his face. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it was hiding something. Harold pushed deeper into the trees, his breath sharp in his ears. He hadn't moved as fast in years, and his knees protested with every step. But his instinct, or maybe something older and heavier, kept him going. Then he saw it, a smear of blood on the snow. Fresh, bright, still warm enough not to freeze. Harold swallowed hard and crouched, running his fingers through the crimson stain. The forest around him suddenly felt too quiet, as if even the animals were holding their breath. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone hurt?" Silence answered. He moved forward, following the faint trail of blood drops. Each one pulled him deeper into the woods, past old fallen logs and trees bent low from the storm. He felt a strange, unsettling sensation that someone had walked these woods recently, someone carrying something heavy or wounded, or both. Then he found it, a glove, half buried in snow, torn at the palm, stained with blood, and beside it, footprints, the same boot prints he had seen outside his cabin. Harold's stomach twisted. "Who are you?" he whispered. The prints led forward, weaving clumsily between trees, as if the person had staggered. Harold followed them, heart pounding harder with each step. The trail grew messier, more erratic, until it suddenly stopped at the base of a massive pine. Harold raised his lantern higher. His breath froze. There, barely visible through the snow, was a shape, slumped against a tree, unmoving. A person. Harold rushed forward, falling to his knees beside them. It was a man, middle-aged, gaunt, his face pale as ice. His lips were blue. His chest rose in the faintest, weakest breaths. And around his neck was a ripped piece of leather identical to Ranger's collar. Harold's voice cracked. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Harold with immense effort. He gasped a whisper that sounded more like a ghost than a man. "Dog, the dog." Harold leaned close. "I have him. He's safe." The man's breath hitched. Relief or pain, Harold couldn't tell. "He found you," Harold said urgently. "He made it to my porch." The man blinked slowly, tears gathering at the corners of his frozen eyes. "He came back," the man whispered. Harold felt his heart twist. "Who are you? Did you send Ranger to me?" The man nodded weakly, then coughed, blood staining the snow. "Please," the man gasped. "Take care of him. Don't let him die alone." Harold swallowed hard. "I won't." The man closed his eyes again, whispering something so faint Harold had to lean in until their foreheads nearly touched. "He's all I had left." Then his body went still. Harold stayed frozen, breath trembling, staring at the lifeless man in the snow. Whoever he was, he had died trying to reach Harold. Slowly, Harold lifted his head toward the direction of the cabin. Ranger wasn't just any dog. He wasn't just old. He wasn't just sick. He was the final wish of a dying man. And somehow, he belonged to Harold Long, before either of them understood why. Harold didn't move for a long moment. The forest around him stood frozen in reverent silence, as if the trees themselves understood what had happened. Snow drifted quietly over the lifeless man's shoulders, settling like a final blanket. Harold's breath trembled in the cold air, clouding around his face as he tried to steady himself. A stranger had died in his arms, but not a stranger to Ranger, and not a stranger to the truth Harold had been avoiding. Harold swallowed hard and finally forced himself to act. He closed the man's eyes gently, then removed his gloves and tucked them over the man's chest, a small gesture of respect. This man had braved the storm to deliver Ranger to safety. He deserved more than to be left alone in the snow. "I'll come back for you," Harold whispered, his voice cracking. "I promise." The wind picked up, rustling the branches above. Harold pushed to his feet, pain flaring through his knees. He leaned against the tree for balance. Every part of him wanted to collapse, grief, shock, confusion, but there wasn't time for that. Ranger was waiting. Harold began the long walk back to the cabin, following his own trail of footprints. The forest felt different now, heavier, charged with meaning. Ranger hadn't arrived by accident. Someone had carried him through the storm. Someone who loved him deeply. Someone who had known Harold's name. The pieces were falling into place, but Harold didn't like where they were leading. When he reached the cabin, he heard a faint scratching at the door. As soon as he opened it, Ranger nearly collapsed into him. The old shepherd's tail wagged weakly, but his eyes widened at the scent of snow and death lingering on Harold's coat. "It's all right," Harold whispered, lowering himself to the floor. "I'm here." Ranger pressed his head against Harold's chest. The tremble in the dog's body wasn't from cold this time. It was from knowing something was wrong. Dogs always knew. Harold cupped Ranger's face, forcing a faint smile. "You were waiting for him, weren't you? For the man who brought you here." Ranger blinked slowly, a single tear of recognition or memory shining in his tired eye. Harold inhaled shakily. He didn't make it. The dog let out a low, grieving whine, a sound that broke something inside Harold in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was the sound of a creature mourning not just a loss, but a life. Harold wrapped his arms around the shepherd, holding him as tightly as the dog's frail bones would allow. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Ranger's fur. "I'm so damn sorry." They stayed like that for several long minutes, two old souls stitched together by grief, both having lost the last person who truly needed them. Eventually, Harold pulled back and wiped his eyes. "I need to tell you something, boy, and I need to hear it myself." Ranger lifted his head. "You're not dying here," Harold said firmly, voice shaking but certain. "Not in some random cabin. Not alone. Not abandoned. Not like before." He swallowed hard. "I'm going to take care of you, for as long as you have left." Ranger's tail thumped once. "And I'm going to bury him," Harold added softly. "The man who brought you here. I won't let him vanish into the snow." Ranger rested his paw on Harold's knee. The same gesture Buddy used to do. The same gesture Harold had once believed he would never feel again. Harold closed his eyes against the flood of emotion. "I don't know who he was to you. A friend? A partner? A last family member? But I know he trusted me with you. And I'm not going to break that trust." A faint whine escaped Ranger, grief mixing with relief. Harold stroked the dog's fur gently. "You're home now, Ranger. As long as I'm alive, you won't spend another day alone." Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a fragile sliver of blue sky. Inside, for the first time in years, Harold felt something warm rising inside his chest. Purpose, connection, a promise worth keeping. Neither the old man nor the old dog knew what waited ahead, but for the first time, they knew they wouldn't face it alone. Harold knew what he needed to do the moment the sun broke through the clouds. The storm had calmed, leaving the forest quiet, untouched, and almost painfully peaceful, a stark contrast to the weight pressing on his chest. Ranger lay beside the fire, eyes drifting open and closed, exhausted but aware. The old shepherd watched Harold with a mixture of trust and sorrow, as if he already sensed what was coming. Harold knelt beside him and stroked his fur gently. "I have to bring him home, boy," he whispered. "The man who brought you here, he shouldn't be left out there." Ranger let out a soft grunt, pushing his nose weakly into Harold's hand, giving permission. Harold bundled himself in his coat, grabbed a shovel, and stepped back into the cold. Every step back into the woods felt heavier than the last. The forest silence pressed into him, amplifying the memory of the dying man's final words. "Take care of him. Don't let him die alone." By the time Harold found the man again, snow had begun to settle on his still body. Harold knelt, brushing away gently. "You cared about him," he murmured. "He mattered to you." He dug through the snow until his muscles shook, until sweat streaked down his temples despite the cold. When the grave was finally ready, Harold lifted the man carefully and laid him to rest beneath a tall pine where sunlight filtered through the branches. He bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him to me." Then he covered the man with snow, packing it softly, respectfully, until the forest reclaimed him. The walk back felt different, not lighter, not easier, but steadier, as if something inside Harold had aligned. When he reached the cabin and opened the door, Ranger lifted his head at the sound. "I buried him," Harold said softly, sitting beside the dog again. "He's at peace now." Ranger closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, a sound that almost resembled relief. Harold fed him, watered him, warmed him, doing everything he could. But even as Ranger ate small bites of chicken and leaned his weight against Harold's leg, the old man felt the truth in every subtle tremble of the shepherd's body. Ranger didn't have much time left. That evening, Harold sat in the rocking chair, Ranger's head resting on his boot. Outside, the sky turned shades of pink and gold, painting the snow in soft, warm colors. It was the kind of sunset Mary would have loved, the kind of moment Harold had stopped noticing years ago. But tonight, he noticed everything. As the fire crackled quietly, Ranger shifted, struggling to raise himself but failing. Harold moved quickly to steady him. "Easy, boy, easy." Ranger looked up at him. Truly looked, with eyes that held 20 years of unspoken stories. Pain, loyalty, loss, love, all tangled together in a single gaze. Harold swallowed, tears stinging his eyes. "Buddy had a brother once," he whispered. "A young pup from the same litter. He was adopted by a family down the mountain. I never saw him again." Ranger blinked slowly. Harold's voice cracked. "That brother, his name was Ranger." The shepherd's tail thumped once, tired but sure. Harold's breath hitched. "It's you," he whispered. "You were Buddy's brother. You found your way back to me after all these years." Ranger pressed his head weakly into Harold's hand. It was all the confirmation he needed. Harold held him close, tears falling silently. "I'm sorry your owner died," he whispered. "I'm sorry you had to come here alone. But I'm glad, so glad, you came to me." The shepherd's breathing slowed, then slowed again. Harold wrapped both arms around him, lowering his forehead to Ranger's. "I'm here," he whispered. "You're not alone. Not anymore." In the soft glow of the firelight, wrapped in the warmth of the only home he had left, Ranger exhaled a long, peaceful breath, and didn't take another. Harold didn't let go, not for a long time. He held Ranger as the old shepherd slipped quietly into the same peace his brother had found years before. When he finally lifted his head, tears fell freely down his wrinkled cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, "for coming home." He buried Ranger beside the tall pine where the man rested, letting the two final pieces of their shared story be reunited in the quiet heart of the mountain. From that day forward, Harold visited their graves every morning. He talked to them both about the weather, about memories, about the ways grief and love intertwined. The mountains no longer felt empty, and neither did he, because Ranger had brought him purpose. Buddy had given him love, and a stranger had trusted him with the last good thing he had. Before he left each day, Harold would place his hand on the snow-covered earth and whisper, "You're home now, boys. You're finally home."